Okay, this is a reaction video. This is another video from Lawrence Lost in the Pond. 7 myths British people believe about America. Well, this is kind of interesting for me because I've done a few of these videos, like what people think of, what we think about people do in Europe versus what people think we do in America. Let's see what 7 myths are that people believe about America.
Hello, this video is sponsored by BritBox, the premier streaming service for Britain's most beloved TV shows. I'm Lawrence Brown and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to myths. Specifically, myths that British people, including myself at one point, believed about the United States of America. But it is amazing what 14 years of living in the United States will do to your understanding and your perceptions about this very country. For instance, I learned early on that they don't have Cornish pasties, and I learned slightly less
I don't even know what the hell a Cornish pasty is.
earlier on, so later, that Michigan has them. But I don't live in Michigan, so one way
I don't live in Michigan either. I've never had a Cornish pasty.
or another, I still have to have them imported. A quick reminder that if you're not subscribed to this channel, you can change that fact about your life
Yes, please click like, share, and subscribe for Lawrence. Please click like, share, and subscribe for me as well.
right now. But these myths go way beyond the absence of quintessentially British food. And so now that I've lived here for about a seventh of a century, it's time to outline some of the myths that us British believe about America and Americans. This is a funny one, because I think television gives us this notion that Americans do all
Yeah, I do not live in a giant house. I kind of grew up in a medium-sized house, to be honest with you. But my parents, when I was in high school, we bought a pretty big-sized house. But for the most part, we don't all live. My cousin, just like I do, live in a condo, which is like a apartment. But no, we don't live in giant houses.
live in giant houses like the McAllisters do in Home Alone, but it's not entirely the case. Sure, I mean, statistically, American houses are on average larger than their UK counterparts. There are a number of reasons for this, which I outlined in this video. But to say that all Americans live in really large houses is a complete fabrication of anything resembling the truth. And I was a good example of this before I became a YouTube sensation, because when I first moved to Chicago, we had to do things on a budget. Between me and my wife, we weren't making a great income, and this is a major city, so we had to sort of settle for an apartment whose dimensions were 300 square feet.
Yeah, if you're living on a budget, you're living in a big city like Chicago or Los Angeles or uh, New York or someplace like that, you're going to live on a budget. You're going to have your space is going to be very, very limited.
And for those of you who don't know, that's about the size of a shoebox, roughly. You know, we had to leave our
Oh, you're living in luxury. It's the size of a shoebox.
shoes outside the door. That's how small it was. And it is worth reiterating, I think, that the cost of living in the United States does fluctuate massively across the country. When I lived in Indiana, just one state over, we were paying about $530 a month.
That's very cheap compared to what it is nowadays.
Basically unheard
Because in California, if you get a size of that, probably paying $2,000 a month.
of in Chicago. And it's certainly unheard of in New York City, which of course was the city in which the show Friends is set. And I think it's shows like that that gave us this impression that Americans were all living in big apartments.
Yeah, that's nonsense. I mean, there's no way the people and the characters and Friends could have afforded where they were living at, even if they had two to a place. It just wouldn't happen.
And speaking of houses, I
Yeah, H Street doesn't have 1,000 houses. We have a few. I mean, it depends on where you're at.
was alerted to a tweet recently from a British person who couldn't believe that American addresses go way up into the thousands, and their belief on this was that every street in the United States has thousands of houses on it.
No, it doesn't work like that.
And this was a belief that I used to have, because the country is absolutely massive, so you almost expect it to have to.
Look, the place that I lived in Pickerington, which is not too far from where I live right now, the street number was 8817. So it was in the 8,000s.
House that many people. But the thing is, there are way fewer people in this country per square mile than there are in Britain, so it doesn't add up. And that's when I got looking into it, and in a previous video I outlined it doesn't really work like that. On any given street, they don't start at the number 1 and then end at 10,000. Often, and it's the case here in Chicago, you'll use
In fact, I don't even know how they do it, how they come up with those numbers.
Usually have a string of houses, for example, all in the 6,000s on a given street. And that's because it's about 6 miles from the center of downtown.
Well, that because if that's what it is, we weren't 8 miles from downtown, so again, I don't know how they come up with those numbers.
1 mile in from that, they're all 5,000s. Another mile, they're all 4,000s, etc., etc. Now, not every city in the US does it from the center of the city. It could be from another part of the city or just some other central point. But that's sort of a general rule for how the numbering works on US houses. This one comes up again and again, that the United States is such a young country that it basically doesn't have a history.
Oh, we have a history. Don't you worry about that. I've got quite a history.
And I've always thought of this perception of America to be quite a lazy one. Because even if you go back to 1776 through to the present day, yes, it is a short amount of time in comparison to the history of Britain, but think about all of the insane things that happened in that period. And even if you ignore all that, there's one thing that we tend to forget because we don't get taught it very deeply in Britain, and that is the thousands of years of native history that happened before we even turned up. I was absolutely blown away, not literally, that would be weird, when I went to Cahokia Mounds here in Illinois. Many hundreds of years ago, Cahokia Mounds used to be a native city, and it had about 20,000 people, which might not sound like a lot.
There's actually a huge history if you want to dig into it to find out the people who came before the first explorers came to the United States or America, and like Leif Erikson preceded Christopher Columbus and so forth. But yeah, there's a lot of Native American history that you can actually find when you go to certain places in the United States.
By both American and British standards, but back in the day that was more than London. And I once read about this volcano eruption that happened in present-day Oregon a few thousand years ago. And this eruption was witnessed and recorded by Native Americans who were in the area at the time. And long story short, they basically saw the origins of Crater Lake, which is absolutely huge. To be honest, both Brits and Americans love their myths. I mean, we've got the Loch Ness Monster, you've got a cryogenically frozen Walt Disney. This one is embarrassing.
Yeah, the U.S. and Canada are basically the same. We're not the same. I've been up to Canada on several occasions, and there are similarities, but they are not the same.
Embarrassing for me, because years ago I believed that Canada and the United States were basically the same country. And the reason that I believe that is, number one, I was 12, so cut me some slack, and number
Slack cut.
two, my only sort of exposure to both countries was through the people, was through the way they spoke. And to my young ears, which couldn't yet differentiate these two accents, Macho Man Randy Savage and Bret Hart basically had the same accent, just with an...
Well, to be fair, Bret Hart is half American. His mom's from New York. His dad's from Canada. Now, I'm sure he considers himself completely Canadian because he grew up there, and that's perfectly fine. But he's, technically speaking, half American. Randy Savage, or Randy Poffo, was born where I'm at, Columbus, Ohio.
Entirely different timber. And that's all I had to go on. And I think it's what a lot of British people have to go on, because I still occasionally see those comments. Oh, what is the difference between Canada and America? Or is it essentially that one has Mounties and the other doesn't? And it's only since I moved here that I've become super aware of the substantial difference between the two countries. Completely different healthcare systems, completely different food, completely different use of English. Right? In Britain, we call it the loo. In America, they call it a restroom. In Canada, they call it a washroom. And I've seen all manner of different examples of that kind.
That's all different. What we call it, the bathroom or the toilet, or where you do use the facilities, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, the first time I ever heard loo, where the hell does that come from? But that is what it is.
Of thing. In America, they don't
Say that a lot. No, it is what it is.
Celebrate Boxing Day. In Canada, they do. The Canadian dollar is different to the American dollar. In some ways, they go with...
Yeah, when I was in Canada, I went to a casino and I won $2,000 on one of their um, uh, casinos, and I think I may have spent 100. I gave $100 to $110 to my brother-in-law, and he lost it. And I walked out of there with like $1,790 Canadian money. When I converted that to American currency, it came up to $1,260. I mean, I'm not complaining. Don't get me wrong, but still, that's a difference.
with British English in places that America doesn't. And now that I'm older and I've listened to some of the regionalisms throughout the United States, even the way Americans speak is different to how Canadians speak. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but these differences certainly go way beyond how the two countries pronounce the word about.
Now, Americans can be loud. Americans have a reputation of being loud.
I touched on this before, but I couldn't really do a video without including it in this list. This perception that Americans are loud and boisterous. And I can understand on some level where that comes from, because I think the way Americans speak, it comes from a different part of the throat. So it's a bit...
And to be fair, when I was in Germany, the loudest people that I ever came across were the English. There was a woman, she must have been two or three places down from me she must have worked for, I don't know if she worked for Sky or she worked for one of the TV shows because she was always talking about Beckham and talking about Rooney and interviews and things like that. She was talking TV stuff and she was about two or three rows down from me, but it was like she was sitting right next to me and talking to me. I almost wanted to, if I, as loud as she was, if I turned to the right, I felt I could say, hey, you don't have to talk so loud, but she was pretty loud. But I know Americans can be loud too.
A bit more projected, right? Whereas us Brits, it's more sort of, I don't know, understated a lot of the time. I think another reason that we think Americans are loud is how they present themselves in films. There might even have been a time in my life where I thought all Americans were loud just because Jim Carrey was. He's Canadian, isn't he? He is Canadian.
Yeah, Jim Carrey is Canadian.
And culturally speaking, I definitely have found that Americans speak at a higher volume when they're in restaurants together, but there are so many other examples of the opposite being true. On match day, after we've had a pint or six,
Yeah, I'd like to go to a football match in England and see what that's like.
We're singing the songs of our team, who we love.
Assuming your team won. Well, maybe you guys sing when you lose, too. I mean, because this looks like Leeds. At least that's what I'm basing the Scarf on. I don't know.
Because they happen to be situated in the town that we were born in. And it's just what we do when we leave a nightclub, which, I haven't done in 20 years. But when we did, I'd be on the street yelling at traffic cones, because that might have just been me. But what I'm saying is, when we get drunk, we very much give Americans a run for their money.
Yeah, I would. I've seen drunk Brits before. When we got to Frankfurt in 2006, England, I believe, played Paraguay the day before. They were still out there partying, and they were very loud and rambunctious. Very, very, it was very fascinating to watch.
There's a loud person in all of us, right? And once we free ourselves of our inhibitions, we can let out all of the decibels we want. That's not a call to action. It's merely an observation. This is only funny, not because of the image of Americans walking around with bum bags on, but it's because we call them bum bags and you call them fanny packs, and it's bloody hilarious. It is also partly the visual, because bum bags have never been cool.
I've never worn one of those before.
But this notion, which I occasionally read...
But they do seem to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very useful.
That Americans are just always walking around
or practical.
Wearing one is very laughable, especially as somebody who's lived here 14 years. So it's quite dumbfounding, this one. I'm not saying that all British people think this way, but the ones that do, I'd be very interested to hear, do they think that way because they met an American in 1994 and they've just held on to that belief? Or are American tourists still wearing bum bags?
Or fanny packs. I mean, I've never worn one, but...
do people carry cash? But I don't. I can tell you this, I don't have a bum bag / fanny pack radar, right? I am not constantly surveilling.
That's true. Me neither. I'm never looking constantly. I do see them occasionally, but I don't see them very often.
The populace to see whether they do or do not have a fanny pack. But my feeling is, I don't remember seeing one in a while. So I think this is one very time-specific stereotype that can now be laid to rest, all right? And
we do say autumn. I mean, we say fall, but we say autumn too.
Yes, I thought I'd include one that was quite topical, not just because we are in the autumn, but also because I mentioned this fact on my YouTube short yesterday. Now, while for reasons that were laid out in that YouTube short, Americans prefer the term fall, I was surprised to find that the word autumn was pretty common among Americans. I don't know if this is a recent thing, like the whole country just woke up one...
I've always said autumn or fall. I mean, I don't have one or the other. And most people I talk to generally say fall, but fall weather and things like that. But autumn is used as well.
Morning and watched Lost in the Pond and thought to themselves, yes, we're changing things now. Or if it's just sort of always been here as an alternative to fall. And you might be thinking, ooh, Lawrence, aren't there many surprising word alternatives that Americans use that Brits don't know about? And the answer to that is yes. I merely brought this one up so I could make that very.
Loo is one of them. If I say I'm going to the loo, people would say, "What the hell are you talking about? What's a loo?" Because that's something that's word that's one thing we don't use now. The only reason I know about loo because I remember watching a TV show called Coupling, and they said off to the loo, and I went, loo, and then I got the impression that's the restroom.
Point. This is undoubtedly a pandemic era thing, but I've seen an increasing number of Americans using the word jab to mean shot. I once worked with an American colleague who liked to use the word bonkers. So in part because of the internet, just as Britain is taking on quite a few Americanisms, I think the same is true in reverse, and it will be very interesting to look further into those details. And those are just a handful of myths that some Brits believe about America and Americans. Let me know in the comments some of the myths that you've had to dispel about this country. I'm Lawrence Brown. You can follow me on Twitter at Lost in the Pond US, and please subscribe to this channel and ensure to click my bell. And if you like what you see, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lostinthepond. Until the next video, goodbye.
Yeah, please click like, share, and subscribe for Lawrence, Lost in the Pond, and please click like, share, and subscribe for me. But like loo and restroom, what we call it. I'll go back here quick. We call these chips. You guys call them crisps. We call them French fries. You call them chips. So another things that few things that we say here in the United States, you have different words for, and that's all fine and well. That's what makes us unique. But please click like, share, and subscribe for Lawrence. Please click like, share, and subscribe for me, and have a good rest of your day. And thanks for watching.